The day my mother hemorrhaged during the difficult labor of her second child. And my father, a man worth hundreds of millions, pulled every doctor off her to go treat his mistress's migraine because the woman had wed that all the crying was giving her a headache. That night, my mother and my unborn brother both died in agony. And the mistress arranged to have me thrown out of the house. 20 years passed. Through the charity of my mother's best friend and a drive that nearly killed me, I became the woman who now ran a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. They called me Miss Butler. It was the company's annual conversion review and my assistant handed me 5 files, pointed at the girl on the first page full of praise. Miss Butler, this one, Lisa Butler, has done excellent work. Almost every supervisor gave her near-perfect marks. I opened Lisa Butler's profile and my eyes stopped on the line listing family members. Those 2 names, I wouldn't forget if you burned me to ash. After a long moment, I told my assistant to bring all 5 interns in. One by one, the conversion contracts went down the table. When I reached the last person, I lifted my head, met her sure of herself eyes, and calmly slid the termination letter across to her. Lisa Butler, you didn't make the cut. The air in the conference room seemed to freeze. On the spot, the other 4 interns stood there holding their conversion contracts at a loss, every one of them glancing at Lisa. My assistant froze, too, standing at my side. She shot me an anxious look. Miss Butler. I acted as if I hadn't seen it. My gaze level on the girl in front of me. She looked very much like her mother. The same beauty, the same cleverness, the same superiority she'd been born wearing. Of everyone in that room, Lisa was the only one who didn't panic. She simply blinked once, startled, then settled back into composure almost at once. She opened the folder she'd brought without hurry and laid its contents flat across the table. Miss Butler, I've interned at your company for 3 months and handled 4 projects, 2 of them entirely on my own. Client renewal rate 100%. Her tone was even, neither meek nor pushy, and perfectly organized. Top marks on 2 straight quarterly reviews and the highest numbers of any intern in my cohort. When she'd finished, she paused and raised her eyes to me. When I'd finished reviewing all of the conversion results, I was under the impression this company rewarded performance. The room fell silent. Lisa's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The other interns looked down, pretending not to listen. My assistant looked as though she wanted to disappear through the floor. I studied the young woman in front of me. 20 years ago, her mother had stood over a frightened 6-year-old girl clutching a torn backpack and told the servants to throw her out of the house. I still remembered the rain. I still remembered the gates closing behind me. And now that woman's daughter was sitting across from me, questioning my decision. Life had a twisted sense of humor. Are you saying I made a mistake? I asked calmly. No. Lisa met my gaze directly. I'm asking what standard was used. Not bad. Most people either groveled or became emotional when their future was on the line. This one had courage. Unfortunately for her, courage wasn't going to save her. I closed the file. The standard is mine. For the first time, a flicker of disbelief crossed her face. Miss Butler. Meeting adjourned. The 4 successful interns practically fled. Lisa remained seated. Everyone else slowly filed out until only 3 people were left in the room. Her. Me. And my assistant. The moment the door closed, Lisa spoke again. May I ask one question? I nodded. Is this personal? The room became very quiet. Interesting. Very interesting. She had figured it out. My assistant's eyes widened. I leaned back in my chair. What makes you think that? Lisa stared at me for several seconds. Because this is the only explanation that fits. She slid the performance reports toward me. These numbers are objective. Then she tapped the termination letter. This isn't smart. Far smarter than her mother ever was. I almost smiled. Then perhaps you should ask your parents. For the first time, her confidence cracked. What do my parents have to do with this? I stood. The meeting was over. That's all, Miss Butler. She left with the termination letter in her hand. But the expression on her face told me she wasn't finished. Not even close. 3 days later, my assistant burst into my office looking alarmed. Miss Butler. I glanced up from my documents. What is it? Lisa Butler is downstairs. I raised an eyebrow. Security couldn't remove her? They tried. My assistant hesitated. She's not causing trouble. What is she doing? Waiting. I set down my pen. Waiting? Since 6 this morning. I looked at the clock. It was almost 4 in the afternoon. 10 hours. Interesting. Bring her up. A few minutes later, Lisa entered my office. She looked tired but determined. In her hands was a thick stack of papers. Without speaking, she placed them on my desk. I looked down. Medical records. Birth certificates. Property transfers. Bank statements. My eyes narrowed. Lisa's voice was quieter than before. I asked my parents. I slowly turned another page. There was my mother's name. There was the hospital record. There was the night. The night that destroyed everything. The color drained from Lisa's face. My mother admitted it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The office seemed suddenly smaller. I didn't believe her at first. Her hands trembled slightly. Then I found more records. I kept reading. Every page was another knife. Evidence. Proof. Documents that had been buried for 20 years. Proof that my father had diverted doctors away from a dying woman. Proof that his mistress had paid employees to remove a child from her home. Proof that they had spent decades hiding it. I finally looked up. Lisa's eyes were red. You knew? Yes. And that's why you fired me? Yes. She laughed bitterly. A broken sound. My whole life. She swallowed. My whole life I thought my family was respectable. I said nothing. What was there to say? The sins weren't hers. But neither were they mine. For several minutes, silence hung between us. Finally she asked. What happens now? I rose from my desk and walked to the window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched for miles. Everything I had built. Everything I had earned. Every victory paid for with blood, hunger, humiliation, and sleepless nights. I thought of my mother. I thought of the brother who never took his first breath. Then I turned back. What happens now depends on you. Lisa looked confused. I opened a drawer and removed another file. Then I placed it in front of her. She stared. Employment contract. Her eyes widened. I don't understand. You earned the position. Shock flashed across her face. But I fired you because I wanted to know whether you were your mother's daughter. I met her gaze. Or your own person. Lisa looked down at the contract. Then back at me. What if I refuse? Then you walk away. What if I accept? My expression remained calm. Then you'll work twice as hard as everyone else. Why? Because people will assume you're only here because of me. A long silence followed. Then slowly, Lisa signed. Not because I forgave her family. Not because the past had disappeared. But because for the first time in 20 years, someone carrying the Butler name had chosen integrity over entitlement. As she handed the contract back, she hesitated. Miss Butler. Yes? Will you go after them? I looked down at the mountain of evidence spread across my desk. My father. The woman who had destroyed my family. The people who had helped them. 20 years had passed. But justice had no expiration date. A cold smile appeared on my lips. Yes. And somewhere across the city, the people who thought they had gotten away with murder were about to discover that the little girl they threw into the rain had finally come home. The news broke 48 hours later. Not through tabloids. Not through gossip columns. Through the courts. Through regulators. Through forensic accountants. Through investigators carrying warrants. By noon, every major business channel was running the same headline. Butler family patriarch under investigation for fraud, bribery, and evidence tampering. I watched the reports from my office. No satisfaction. No triumph. Just a strange sense of inevitability. 20 years was a long time. But some deaths waited patiently. My assistant entered carrying a tablet. Miss Butler, your father is here. I didn't even look away from the screen. Which entrance? The front. I laughed softly. Of course he was. The man had always believed doors would open for him. Did security stop him? 3 times. And? He says he's your father. The word felt foreign. Father. A man who had watched my mother die. A man who had never once searched for the child thrown onto the street afterward. Bring him up. 5 minutes later, the office door opened. The man who entered looked 10 years older than the photographs I'd seen. His hair had gone mostly gray. The expensive suit couldn't hide the exhaustion in his face. The moment he saw me, he froze. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered. You look just like your mother. I continued reading the report in front of me. Interesting. His face tightened. I've been trying to contact you. I know. You blocked every number. I know. Silence. He took a step forward. I didn't know where you went. That made me look up. For the first time. For the first time in 20 years, I looked directly into the eyes of the man responsible for ruining my life. You didn't know? His mouth opened. Then closed. I stood. Slowly. Deliberately. You had private investigators. Another step. You had lawyers. Another. You had enough money to search the entire country. I stopped in front of him. So let's not insult each other. The color drained from his face. For a moment, I saw fear. Good. He should be afraid. You knew exactly where I went. My voice remained calm. You just didn't care. His shoulders sagged. And that told me everything. No denial. No argument. Because it was true. Finally he lowered his head. I'm sorry. 20 years. 20 years of hunger. 20 years of struggling. 20 years of wondering why I wasn't worth saving. And all he had was 2 words. I'm sorry. I almost laughed. Instead, I walked back to my desk. You should leave. His eyes widened. That's it? What were you expecting? Emotion flickered across his face. Regret. Desperation. Maybe even guilt. Too late. Far too late. I'm still your father. The room went quiet. Then I smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. The kind of smile that made grown men nervous. No. I pressed a button on my desk. The large screen behind me lit up. Hundreds of files appeared. Financial records. Witness statements. Hospital reports. Everything. His face went white. You. I spent 12 years collecting evidence. The screen changed again. Showing transfers. Bribes. False statements. Hidden accounts. His knees nearly gave out. You planned this. No. I met his gaze. You planned this. I pointed toward the documents. You planned it 20 years ago. For the first time, genuine panic appeared in his eyes. The confident businessman vanished. Now he was just an aging man watching consequences arrive. Please. I hadn't expected that. Begging. He was actually begging. Please don't destroy everything. I stared at him. Then slowly asked. Did my mother beg? His lips trembled. Did she? No answer. Because we both knew she had. A woman bleeding to death while doctors were pulled away. A woman watching her child disappear. A woman abandoned by the man she trusted most. Of course she had begged. I pressed the intercom. Security. The door opened immediately. 2 guards entered. My father looked at me one last time. The desperation in his eyes was almost painful to witness. Almost. Please, he whispered. I looked away. Escort Mr. Butler out. The guards took his arm. He didn't resist. The fight had already left him. As the door closed behind him, I returned to my paperwork. My assistant stood silently nearby. After a while, she finally asked. Do you feel better? I considered the question. Then shook my head. No. Justice wasn't happiness. Revenge wasn't healing. Nothing would bring my mother back. Nothing would let my little brother live. Nothing would return the childhood I lost. But accountability mattered. Truth mattered. And for the first time in 20 years, the truth was finally being heard. 3 months later, the verdicts began arriving. One by one. Convictions. Asset seizures. Prison sentences. Civil judgments worth hundreds of millions. The Butler empire collapsed faster than anyone thought possible. The newspapers called it one of the largest corporate downfalls in decades. I never gave interviews. Never celebrated. Never commented. The story wasn't about business. It was about consequences. And consequences had finally arrived. One evening, long after the chaos ended, I stood before a simple grave. Fresh flowers rested beside the headstone. The wind moved softly through the trees. For a long time I said nothing. Then quietly. It's over, Mom. The words felt strange. Like setting down a weight I'd carried so long I no longer remembered life without it. A tear slid down my cheek. The first one in years. I made it. The city lights glittered in the distance. The company was thriving. The people I loved were safe. The future stretched ahead of me. And for the first time since I was 6 years old, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like living. The breeze stirred again. Warm. Gentle. Almost like a hand brushing through my hair. I smiled through the tears. Then turned and walked forward. Leaving the past where it belonged. Behind me. The story could have ended at the convictions. But life rarely ends so neatly. For my father and his mistress, the real ruin began afterward. Prison was only the beginning. Everything they had built their identities around disappeared piece by piece. The mansions were auctioned. The luxury cars were seized. The private clubs revoked their memberships. The friends who had once lined up to flatter them suddenly couldn't remember their phone numbers. Money had bought them loyalty. The moment the money vanished, so did everyone else. My father's former business partners testified against him to save themselves. Executives he had promoted handed investigators documents. Even distant relatives publicly denied being connected to him. Within a year, the Butler name had become toxic. No bank would touch it. No investor would trust it. No company wanted the association. The mistress suffered even more. For decades, she had enjoyed being admired. Now every headline referred to her as the woman whose selfish demand contributed to a mother's death. People who once envied her now despised her. She couldn't walk into a restaurant without whispers following her. Couldn't open a newspaper without seeing another article about the scandal. Couldn't escape the truth she had spent 20 years hiding. Then came the civil suits. Former employees, shareholders, business partners, creditors. Everyone wanted compensation. The judgments piled up until the numbers became almost meaningless. Hundreds of millions. Then more. Then more. Every remaining asset disappeared. The mansion where she'd once hosted lavish parties sold for a fraction of its value. The jewelry collection she had treasured was auctioned off piece by piece. The paintings came next. Then the vacation properties. Then the last of the bank accounts. Eventually there was nothing left. Absolutely nothing. 5 years later, I received an unexpected report. My assistant placed it on my desk. Private investigators completed the follow-up. I glanced at the file. I hadn't asked for it recently. Years had passed since I stopped paying attention. Still, I opened it. The first page contained a recent photograph of my father. I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the powerful executive. Gone were the tailored suits. Gone was the confidence. An old man stared back at me. Thin. Bent. Forgotten. After serving his sentence, he'd been unable to find work. No company wanted the liability. No one trusted him. The report said he'd been living in a tiny rented room on the outskirts of the city. Most days he spent alone. The second photograph showed his former mistress. Time had been even less kind to her. The beauty she had relied upon all her life had faded. The report stated that she worked occasional temporary jobs when she could find them. Often she couldn't. Sometimes she relied on charity organizations for food. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once thrown a child into the street now depended on strangers for survival. I closed the file. For a long moment, I simply sat there. Not smiling. Not celebrating. Just looking. The complete ruin I'd imagined as a child had finally happened. And yet it felt strangely small. Because the truth was that no punishment could fully balance the scales. My mother was still gone. My brother was still gone. Nothing changed that. A few months later, another report arrived. This one was much shorter. My father had died. A heart attack. Alone. The authorities spent 2 days locating next of kin. Almost nobody attended the funeral. The report included a photograph of the gravesite. A cheap stone. No flowers. No visitors. No family. Just silence. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then placed it back into the folder. That night, I visited my mother's grave. The moon hung low above the cemetery. The flowers I brought looked bright against the stone. I knelt beside her. For a while, I simply sat there. Then I spoke softly. The story is over. The wind rustled through the trees. 20 years of hatred. 20 years of planning. 20 years of waiting. Finished. The people responsible had lost everything. Their wealth. Their power. Their reputation. Their future. Even their names. And yet the greatest victory wasn't their destruction. It was that they had failed. They had tried to erase my mother. They had tried to erase me. They had tried to ensure that only their version of history survived. Instead, my mother's name was honored. Her story was known. And the little girl they threw away had become stronger than all of them combined. I placed a hand on the headstone and smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a victorious one. A peaceful one. Because in the end, complete ruin wasn't watching your enemies lose everything. Complete ruin was realizing that the person you tried to destroy became everything you never could be. And with that, I stood, turned away from the past, and walked toward the future, never looking back again.